The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 24th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to the disciples, "About that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
May you be seated. From Isaiah this morning, "He shall judge between the nations." From Romans, "It is now the moment for you to wake from sleep." And from the Gospel of Matthew, "Therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." This morning's readings are kind of alarming. Ralph Klein, one of my professors from seminary, mentioned that this gospel reading scared the daylights out of him as a child. I can't really blame him. It's kind of the stuff that nightmares are made of, especially for a young child. Imagine them hearing this gospel and thinking that at any moment their mom or their dad or their sister or their brother or their best friend could just vanish. One taken and the other one left. That's scary stuff. But as we dig deeper into these texts, we can understand them in a new way. Instead of fear, we can read these words as texts of hope. The way Dr. Klein explains it, these signs, these alarming images, are of God's onrushing future. He writes, Isaiah's picture of the future depicts God as the one settling all international disputes, making war unnecessary and in fact obsolete. God draws all people to Jerusalem as if by a divine magnet, and there they learn God's ways and God's paths, and they will not study war anymore. Instead, they will transform their swords into stoves and washing machines, and their spears into laptops and mopeds, the 21st century equivalent of plowshares and pruning hooks. With violence in our streets and war and conflict dominating our headlines, we may find this vision hard to believe, even hard to imagine. But the final verse in the first reading expresses a fit liturgical commitment. People of God, let us at least anticipate this onrushing future by starting to walk in God's light. Breaking the chain of violence in our homes, schools, and congregations can be the dawning light of God's promised future. This future, God's promised future, might feel a little bit scary because we don't know exactly what it's going to look like or how it's all going to shape out. But we have the promises of God to hold on to. This is the first Sunday in a new liturgical year, which means that while we spent all of last year mostly focused on the Gospel of Luke, we're now transitioning into mostly focusing on the Gospel of Matthew. And the Gospel of Matthew has these wonderful bookends. The Gospel of Matthew begins with the birth of Christ and the angel telling Joseph that he will be called Emmanuel, which means, anybody? God with us. God is with us. And then the same gospel ends with Jesus telling his disciples, "Remember, I am with you to the end of the age." The Gospel of Matthew is bookended by this promise from God to always be with God's people. God is in our relationships with one another. God is with us in the waters of baptism, in the bread and wine at the table, in our music, in our prayers, in our community. All of God's promises can be boiled down to God's presence with God's creation and God's people. and the desire to reconcile everything to God's self. This is what the season of Advent is about. It is about holding fast to those promises that God has made and anticipating the fulfillment of those promises. The color of Advent is blue. The color of the sky just before dawn begins to break. We await the birth of Christ just as we await the new morn. It will come, both expected and out of the blue. And like Christmas, we know that morning will come, but that doesn't stop us from watching for it, for longing for it. We know that we're going to celebrate the birth of Christ on December 24th and December 25th. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day will be here. But we're going to try really hard to not jump the gun too much here in worship. Don't get me wrong, I love Christmas music. I really do. Been listening to it for a week now. I love the Old English carols sung by the King's College Choir in Cambridge, and I love A Christmas Together, which is an amazing collaboration between John Denver and the Muppets. If you haven't heard it, you should. I love the lights. I love the cookies and sweets. I love the parties, the gift giving, the decorating, the time spent with friends and family. I love the warmth and nostalgia that comes from unwrapping old ornaments or successfully making a family recipe. This time of year is filled with a lot of joy. And there is also a lot of stress, right? Think about your month ahead. Are you feeling pure joy, or is there also a low level of stress that's starting to creep in on you? All around us, decorations are already up. Stores have already been filled with Christmas things. Some people have already finished shopping for their gifts, and the rest of us will either find us in a crowded Target or scouring Amazon and Etsy like 2 days before Christmas. Stressing out about wrapping paper and food and mailing costs and putting up the lights. And then we add to that the people who have lost loved ones or who have strained relationships with friends and family, and grief and loneliness can make getting through the season a real struggle. And this is why I think it's important that we keep Advent in worship in an intentional way. We can still put up our Christmas trees and enjoy the holiday festivities. I'm not ready to give any of that up. But our readings and our music and what happens here when we gather as this community helps us keep it all in perspective. It helps us pause and take a deep breath and really live into this season of anticipation. Writer and scholar Diana Butler Bass wrote an essay many, many years ago exactly on this topic. In her words, she explains why Advent, and in particular a blue Advent, is so important for a person of faith. She writes, "Blue holds the promise that the sun will rise, and that even after the bleakest, coldest, longest night, the light will break forth as the new day arrives. Blue may be the color of sadness, but it is also the color of hope. Many faiths and religious traditions have sacred days or times of waiting, of anticipation, of the expectation of enlightenment, that light breaks through the night. And those sorts of holy days are celebrated when darkness surrounds, when all seems lost, when we hurt and think we have been abandoned, when all promises seem broken, when we light candles against the night, trusting and believing that a greater light will arise, when a single flame becomes a conflagration of compassion and justice." For Christians, Advent is not a time of opening up little windows on Advent calendars filled with chocolates as we await the really big booty of presents under the tree on Christmas morning. That is not what we are waiting for. We are waiting for light, for God to renew and heal the world, a promise that we understand to have been mysteriously embodied in a baby born in a manger. The most wonderful part of it is that this thing that we are waiting for, God's future that we are desperate for, is already coming at us. God is already coming to us, coming to dwell in our hearts and in our lives and in our world. And it is not something to fear, but something to long for, something to hope for in our deepest being. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus tells us to keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. And that can sound ominous. But then I think of one of my favorite Advent hymns that echoes these words. You've probably heard it at least once before. Awake, awake, and greet the new morn. Do you know that Advent hymn? If you don't, I'll try to make sure we get it sung here sometime this season. But it ends like this. Love be our song, and love our prayer, and love our endless story. May God fill every day we share, and bring us at last into glory. That's our story at its core. That's God's story at its core. This Advent, we will wait, we will watch, we will hope, and we will prepare. God's future, a future of new life and unending love, is onrushing to us. Amen.